Abusing the pardon privilege has a torrid and often astounding history, even on a state level. In the early 1920s, Illinois' incredibly corrupt governor, Len Small, sold an estimated 500 pardons before he was indicted and chased from office. Small's broker on the pardon deals was a union extortionist named Umbrella Mike Boyle, a bigwig in the Electrical Workers Union. Among Boyle's clients was Spike O'Donnell, who immediately started the Great Chicago Beer Wars of 1926 upon his release, James Fur Sammons, a lunatic killer who scared even the Capone organization he worked for, and Johnny Touhy, the short-lived boss of the terrible Touhy gang. In the 1970s, when federal prosecutors tried to deport southwestern Pennsylvania mob boss, John S. LaRocca, Governor John Fine pardoned the alleged godfather of corruption along with his capo regime, Frank Rosa. Later, Governor George Earl pardoned mafia boss Joe Luciano, Luigi Quaranta, and alleged caporeime Nicholas Piccolo. He also pardoned Frankie Palermo, an alleged made member of the mafia, Felix Pacicho, a fight fixers named Leo Kaminsky and Louis Barish, suspected mob gamblers. One of the earliest and most outrageous pardons on record belongs to Harry Truman, who pardoned Ice Pick Danny Motto, a labor thug in the Gambino family. Motto had been convicted of wartime racketeering, and as a result, Danny the Ice Pick wasn't allowed to hold an elective office in New York's Bakers Union, Local 350, a 900-member local which he terrorized from 1939 until his death in the 1980s. Motto's 1947 federal racketeering charge, plus a previous conviction for murder, gave the Justice Department due cause to deport the Hood. However, at the last moment, when deportation had been ordered, Truman granted a pardon, and the deportation was canceled. The man who worked behind the scenes on Motto's behalf was his lawyer, Herb Atkin, a shadowy figure with unspecified connections to naval intelligence and later to the CIA. It was Atkin who introduced New York's Lindsay administration to labor mobster, Loan Shark, and Danny Motto's boss, Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, a meeting that would eventually lead to the James Marcus scandal of 1966. Truman also pardoned an enormous number of felons from the Boss Pendergast political machine. More than half of those pardoned were convicted of interfering with a citizen's right to vote, or, in other words, were members of Auntie Madden's goon squads. During his brief presidency, John F. Kennedy issued 472 pardons, more than any chief executive before or since. About half of these appear to be questionable at best. An example is the John Factor pardon. In 1926, John Factor, brother to Max Factor, conned thousands of British citizens out of $8 million in 1928 value. Factor fled England for Chicago and successfully avoided extradition by paying to have himself kidnapped and accused 6 innocent men of the crime who served a total of 130 years for the fake abduction. In 1942, Factor was convicted on federal charges and sentenced to 10 years for a botched confidence scam. Released in 1948, Factor claimed he was broke, but 7 years later, opened the Stardust Casino in Vegas. In 1962, Factor sold his share of the casino, then the largest and most profitable in the world, for a paltry $14 million. The buyer was the mob's other frontman, Mo Dalitz. Chicago bosses Tony Accardo, Paul Ricca, and Murray Humphreys took at least 5 points each from the sale, a point being valued at $125,000. Another Hood, Nick Savella, got $6,000 a month out of the deal, paid by the casino, as a broker's fee. Attorney General Robert Kennedy thought it was a ridiculously small sales figure and ordered an investigation to find out who really owned the Stardust and why the sale price was so small. At the same time, Kennedy's Justice Department and the Nevada State Gaming Commission began scrutinizing the stockholders in the Stardust and opened an investigation in search of hidden assets by the mafia. It was in this atmosphere that the Los Angeles office of the INS decided to deport the 70-year-old Factor to England based on the 1943 fraud conviction. On December 3, 1962, the Department of Justice requested that the Immigration and Naturalization begin proceedings to deport Factor from the United States. Unable to show due cause why he should not be deported, Factor was ordered to surrender to the Los Angeles office of the INS on December 21, 1962, at which point he would be arrested and tossed out of the country. Then the Kennedys gave John Factor a full pardon. But at what cost? The executive clemency had all the earmarks of a mob-style shakedown because just 7 days before Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department ordered Factor deported, on November 26, 1962, the Attorney General did something unusual. He changed the laws that govern presidential pardons. It was only the second time the rules, which are actually a mere 14 sets of suggestions since they are advisory in nature, would be tampered with from 1946 until 1997. Bobby Kennedy changed the rules by cutting out the middleman. All pardon requests went directly to the White House and then to the Justice Department, not the other way around, which is how it was before Factor's pardon was granted. It appears that Bobby's tampering was all about money because one day a very drunken Chucky English, one of Chicago's mob boss Sam Giancana's top men, strolled out of the Armory Lounge, the outfit's meeting place, and leaned up against the FBI observation car parked just across the street from the tavern and started a conversation with the agents who reported that English is bemoaning the fact that the federal government is closing in on the organization and nothing can be done about it. He made several bad remarks about the Kennedy administration and pointed out that the Attorney General raising money for the Cuba invaders makes Chicago's syndicate look like amateurs. What English was talking about in front of a bar on a cold Chicago afternoon was the same thing business executives across the country were whispering about in their paneled boardrooms. Many of the nation's leading CEOs had taken phone calls and were amazed to find themselves on the other end of the phone line with the Attorney General of the United States of America. They were even more amazed at what they heard. Kennedy wanted money to help rescue the Bay of Pigs survivors. The Attorney General reminded the executives that they had either pending contracts before the government or criminal cases pending, brought by the Justice Department. Before they could respond, Kennedy interrupted, mentioned the fund to free the Cubans again, and hung up. Jake Factor was a rich man and nobody's fool. He threw $25,000 cash into the project and explained to a curious press that James Roosevelt, the problem child of the Klan, had approached him about the donation, which he swore had nothing to do with his pardon. He was also one of Kennedy's single largest political contributors. On December 24, 1962, when the press was on Christmas break, from his father's estate in Palm Beach, Florida, John F. Kennedy signed a presidential pardon for Jake the Barber. Pardons are normally granted on a master warrant, and although several sentence reductions were given that day on a master pardon, Factor's was the only single pardon granted. The deportation proceeding against Jake was dismissed on December 26, 1962, and the investigation into the Stardust Casino was quietly drawn to a close. Richard Nixon, who was pardoned by Jerry Ford, pardoned Angelo Gyp DiCarlo, a capo in the Genovese crime family and a major loan shark in northern New Jersey. Officially, DiCarlo got the pardon because he was supposed to be dying of cancer. When released, however, he re-entered the loan sharking business and was suspected in ordering at least one murder within the first 6 months of his release. In 1970, DiCarlo told an FBI undercover agent that he paid singer Frank Sinatra $150,000 in cash to give to Vice President Spiro Agnew to secure the pardon. Nixon also pardoned the mob's personnel loan officer, Teamster President Jimmy Hoffa, in 1974. 3 years later, 2 federal informants reported that Alan Dorfman and gangster Tony Provenzano had each collected about $500,000 in cash, which was delivered to Nixon's counsel, Charles Colson. According to the informants, the money had been skimmed off of the Vegas casinos and was a payoff for both Hoffa's release and for the restrictions on that release, which forbade Jimmy from returning to the union. Business pardons are so commonplace in the upper echelons of the mob that even John Gotti, when imprisoned in the New York City jail, considered offering the Bush White House $1 million for a pardon, just like all those other guys did before international drug dealer Rosario. Sal Gambino made headlines in 2001 when reports surfaced that in 1995 President Bill Clinton's half-brother Roger Clinton, Jr. had allegedly accepted $50,000 and a Rolex watch from Gambino's children. According to reports, in return, Roger said he could guarantee Gambino a presidential pardon by President Clinton. In 1995, Roger Clinton unsuccessfully lobbied officials for parole for Rosario Gambino. In 1999, when the president was prepared to decide who would be pardoned before his final days in office, Gambino's name was on the list for consideration. Ultimately, the president did not grant Gambino a pardon.